Thanks everyone for sticking with us this afternoon. I'm going to make you work halfway through a little bit, so I hope that keeps you from nodding off. And if you're in the back, I'd encourage you to move forward if you're feeling brave, because there will be some things that you may want to read on the slides. I'd also like to thank the other speakers who have spoken this week and for laying the groundwork for what I'm doing today. You've made my job easier and given me some good grounding, so thank you. So today we're going to talk about free, prior, and informed consent to mine development in the Yukon from two angles. So one is institutional norms, so the governance perspective, and one, community's expectations. But I think there are lessons that we can learn from this case study, even if we're not from the Yukon. Before I get any further, I'll introduce myself a little more. My name's Emily Martin, and I'm a settler raised on the Haldimand Tract in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I'd like to thank Son for having me this week. Like Chris said, I have some close connections to this territory, so I'm really grateful to be a guest here. I'd also like to acknowledge that a majority of this research work was conducted on the traditional territory and settlement lands of the Kwanlin-Dun First Nation, the Ta'an Council, and my research partner, the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation. So Gwinnett and Masicho to those nations and all of the citizens who participated. As well, there are going to be a number of hand-drawn illustrations throughout the presentation, and those are done by LSCFN artist Shelby Blackjack, and they come from an illustrated book project that we did together, and I'll say more about that later. Am I echoing to you or just me? Just me, okay. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion we can have today. So first, we're going to look at Yukon's governance context and how those institutions are talking about FPIC. I'll sort of go through that quickly, and then we'll look at One Nation's expectations of a meaningful FPIC process. I know that many people in this room have really long careers and a lot of lived experience on this topic. I recognize that, but what I can offer you today is a really recent picture of what's going on in the Yukon and a really in-depth picture of One Nation, and there may be some lessons there for other groups. If there's time and interest, I can also run you through an evaluation that I did of a certification system for mining, and they've got a whole chapter on FPIC, so we can talk about that if you'd like. So the Yukon, for those of you who aren't familiar, Yukon's governance context is a bit unique because it's home to settled land claims and self-government for the majority of the First Nations there, so those are modern treaties. So the thin lines on this map, on the right, if you can see them, indicate the traditional territories of the 14 First Nations in the Yukon, and there's some overlap there. In 1993, the Umbrella Final Agreement was signed. I'll call it the UFA, probably. And that offered sort of a general framework for individual nations to negotiate their own land claims and self-government agreements. So just a bit of governance background. And the illustration by Shelby there indicates that those agreements were tripartite, so between Canada, the Yukon, and the individual First Nation. And a part of those agreements was the negotiation of settlement lands. So on my map here, you can see those dark purple patches. And those are settlement lands to which First Nations have really strong rights, essentially ownership rights. And in the bottom right corner, you can see that those patches are light purple, and that's because that's Kaska territory. And the Kaska haven't signed final agreements or self-government agreements. The Yukon also has a really long history with mining, so the orange patches on this map are mining tenure. So that's anything from a really small-scale placer mining operation to a big open pit mine. So that's the orange patches. And presently there are 3 really significant mines proposed in the Yukon. So one, you see that little gold star, is Casino's copper gold mine. 2 is Goldcore's Coffee Creek mine near Dawson City. And the 3rd is Selwyn-Shihong zinc lead mine. And last summer, the federal government committed to a major road building project called the Resources Gateway. And that road would connect those 3 proposed mines to other mines and major roads. So that's a significant infrastructure project that they've committed to. But in the context of this research, the Casino mine there sort of features a little more prominently. That's because the Casino mine would be the largest ever constructed in the Yukon, and it's also close to the traditional territory and settlement lands of my research partner, the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation. So this is the context for this research. Both really significant proposed development, like we see here, and well-established First Nations rights through modern treaties. Okay, so the first piece, like I said, let's look at what governance institutions in the Yukon are saying about FPIC. Are they talking about it? Are they not? So is it an established practice or an untraveled path? And this, for me, was motivated by hearing the president of the Casino Mining Corporation, the largest mine in the history of the Yukon, say, it's a bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Let's be honest, you're not going to get a project going forward in the Yukon unless you have the support of the First Nation on whose traditional territory you're moving forward. There hasn't been a mine, to my knowledge, in the past decade without those First Nations essentially giving that consent. So I certainly follow that, the right to FPIC coming from the UN and that commitment from Canada. But I actually think that for resource extraction, particularly in Canada's north, that FPIC is already happening. So I had to ask myself, do the Yukon governance institutions, so those doing environmental and socioeconomic assessment, those giving permits for mines like this one, do they agree that consent is happening, that that's a condition that they're working under? So just so you know how I did this, I did a review of legislation, key legislation and treaty documents, and as well I conducted interviews with representatives of 10 of those key Yukon governance institutions. What I found was that there's really limited discussion of FPIC right now. I heard from governance representatives, FPIC is not usually referenced here in the Yukon. I heard that it's not our bag, not our business, not our responsibility. And also that there hasn't been any requests or pressure or demands by First Nations to think about FPIC more. So these are 3 really specific quotes from individuals, but they represent sort of 3 bigger stories that I heard. So why in a region with this really dynamic and visionary Indigenous governance and modern treaties, as well as significant mineral development proposed, why are they not engaging with FPIC, or at least appear not to be? Something that might address both of those things. So what I heard, sort of factors contributing to this non-engagement with FPIC, were that FPIC is brewing. It might take a while for it to kind of boil over in the Yukon context. Maybe there will be some court cases around it eventually, and it'll all get settled. I also heard that the Yukon is not going to embark on its own interpretation of Canada's commitment to FPIC until it's clear from the feds what that means. That was another common story. And the third thing that we heard was that modern treaties are really respected in the Yukon by many people as the laws of the land, and that governance institutions and First Nations are really busy implementing these modern treaties, which don't contain the language of FPIC. They were negotiated years ago. And so people are busy implementing these treaties. And this finding might also suggest that FPIC, some people think, might not be salient in the Yukon, in their governance context. So back to where we started, Mr. Wes Sells of Casino Mining Corporation thinks that consent is alive and well, but governance institutions say that, we're not really engaging with FPIC. Some people might say not yet. So there appears to be a bit of a difference of opinion here. So this is the governance landscape in the Yukon. But let's look at the story of one First Nation. So this work with the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation represents the bulk of my research work, and it was over kind of 3 years of relationship building, me working on some different projects. And it was to identify expectations for a meaningful process to give or withhold that consent, like Michael said this morning. Basically, this is one community responding to the question, what would it look like for us to give or withhold our consent in a meaningful way on our own terms? What do we think that would look like? So for those of you who aren't familiar, although Randall and Michael tell me that SON has some connections to LSCFN, so some of you might know about them. But LSCFN belongs to the Northern Tutchone Cultural Group. Northern Tutchone is also the language there. They're a self-governing First Nation, and they're about a 2-hour drive north of Whitehorse. They have a population of about 600 citizens. LSCFN citizens is the language they use. And about 300, so about half, live in the Carmacks area. So about half the community members live elsewhere. So if you're wondering what I have to do with LSCFN, I'm from the Grand River Watershed in Ontario. How did I get up there? I worked with LSCFN on this project because of a pre-existing relationship. I'd worked for the nation a year before my master's on some health and well-being work. And I was invited to consider working with them again if we could find a mutually beneficial project, which we did. And so I worked with Chief and Council to find a mutually beneficial project, and then I stayed accountable to them throughout this whole project. So it really was a partnership, and I think we both feel really happy with what we were able to produce. Because my research partners can't be here today, Carmacks is a long way away. I've got a bit of a statement from Alan, the executive director. So I'm grateful to have been able to produce something that was of use and of value for them in their future dealings with the mining sector. So LSCFN and mining, they have a long relationship as a community and a nation with mining. They've got a history as a coal mining town. You can see those old coal carts. They're a bit of a tourist attraction now. Currently, there's an abandoned mine in the community, the Mount Nansen gold and silver mine. There's also some exploration in the area. And in terms of future mining, there's the proposed casino mine. So that's a flyer from a community meeting, an open house. So especially given the significance of the casino proposal and the nation's involvement in a Supreme Court case in 2010 about consultation, LSCFN is a really interesting case for studying expectations of consent. And so you know where the information that I'm about to share with you is coming from. I didn't just make it up off the top of my head. The expectations were identified through interviews with LSCFN government employees, and we also did 4 focus groups or group discussions with about 50 LSCFN citizens. So it's about a third of the adult population who lives in the area. And I also hired community assistant organizers, so some community members could get familiar with the research process, and also ensure that the work that we were doing felt relevant to their community and the methods, too, that we were using. And I'm happy to answer more methods questions at the end if people are curious about this. So what does LSCFN expect of a meaningful process seeking their consent? This is what you all came to hear, I think. So these are 8 considerations that came from scholarship or academic literature, and they were all validated as relevant by LSCFN participants. So these are the importance of early engagement, so a proponent coming early enough in the process to talk to the community. Internal engagement and governance processes, so making use of the community's own traditional or contemporary governance processes. Enforceability of any decision that's made, enforceability of rights, enforceability of any commitments made. That processes are contextually relevant. So for Carmacks, for LSCFN, contextual relevance meant both cultural relevance, so that a process made sense for them as Northern Tutchone people, but also made sense in the context of their modern treaties and the agreements that they've made. Next is appropriate representation, so who can give the consent on behalf of the community, and also who within the community is represented in that consent process. That was really important to people. That definitions of terms like consultation and consent are agreed upon. As Somia said the first day, language is powerful and can also people can have different understandings of the exact same word, so that we agree on that. And that power imbalances in this kind of process are mitigated. That can happen in lots of ways, but that was a theme. And that the process itself is mutually agreed upon. So these are all on that sheet that has been handed out to you as well, if you want to keep looking at them. But what we found in Carmacks also told us that there's some things missing from the literature, from LSCFN's perspective. So we also found that some things that have received no attention by scholarship, or little, are some nuance around what it means to be fully informed as a community, the need for ongoing engagement through a consent process, and once consent has been given, and the mitigation of resource barriers, specifically regarding community members' familiarity with modern treaties and Indigenous rights more generally. So equally important, what I learned in Carmacks makes this presentation in a sort of list not really that accurate for what people told me. So don't get too hung up on trying to read this. The gray bubbles are the same words as you have on the sheet in front of you, but this is just a more relational representation of what you've got there. The lines might look chaotic, but really they just represent that all of these expectations are really intimately connected, and they don't exist in isolation. So for an example, early engagement is connected to cultural relevance of processes, because you want a proponent to come early, get to know the community so they can understand the context, so they can make a process relevant. So those two are closely connected. Many others are too. So these 11 expectations form what we call the evaluative framework, and again, it's what you've got in front of you in a list. And there's clearly too much here for me to present on today, but we will I'll give a little more detail on the three that were kind of new or that emerged from LSCFN. So being informed, ongoing engagement, and the mitigation of resource barriers regarding how much community members feel like they know about their rights and governance. So the first, being informed. And this may seem really obvious because informed is the I of FPIC. But what it means to fully inform a community about a project like a mine, about the scope and possible multi-generational impacts of a project like that is a really huge undertaking for people to be fully informed. So one focus group said, I think the key to giving consent is understanding what you're giving consent for. It seems obvious, but I think it's important that we remember that and hold that at the center of this conversation. For LSCFN, being informed was made up of three factors. Being informed meant having accessible information, having enough time to process that information, and also having transparent information about the process itself and not just the project. So who are the decision makers? When is the next meeting? Who can I tell my concerns to? That kind of thing. And currently in Carmacks, most information about a proposed mine is shared at what people call mining meetings, so usually a meeting held by the proponent, the mining company. And those meetings are usually only attended by people who are looking for work. If people are opposed to a project like a mine, they might see no reason to go to a meeting like that. That's often what people said. So that means that information about a project isn't reaching significant portions of the population, and importantly, it's not reaching the people who might be most concerned or have the most concerns to share. And even when citizens do attend meetings, they actually have the time and energy in their day to go out and go to a meeting. Information has to be accessible in order to be useful. So this is a quote from one elder sort of reflecting on his experience of going to one of these meetings. He said, and the speaker for the company was a fast talker, like I said, trying to be sneaky with his words, using educated words, And the elders would sit there and say, what did he say? And then suddenly they'll say, do we all agree on this? And people are shaking their heads because they didn't catch on to what he was talking about. So this story shows a situation where information was neither accessible, people couldn't process it, and they weren't given enough time to process it and learn about it. So how could they make an informed decision? They really couldn't. So in order to be meaningfully informed, citizens suggested alternative methods of sharing information. They talked about having concise and accessible sort of information packets mailed to everyone's home. So they would have time to look through it, mull it over with people, do a little research on their own. Some people also said that surveys would be really useful, similarly mailed to their house. So if they don't have time or energy to go to a meeting, or if they don't feel confident enough to raise their hand and ask a question, their voice can still be heard. So the next expectation was ongoing engagement. And I think we've talked a little bit about this. I think Michael raised this morning. And it's received some attention in the context of treaties, that a treaty is a relationship and there needs to be ongoing engagement. So similarly for consent, participants said that consent should not be a one-time thing. The concern is that if you sort of give your consent up front, the proponent might go and make changes down the line that really change the project without renewing your consent. Participants felt that for FPIC to be meaningful, there really has to be ongoing relationship and accountability and opportunities to renegotiate that consent that was given. It's not a one-off. So we expect ongoing consultation because consultation should not stop when the mine opens. And I should note here that the language of consultation is used as part of a consent process. And this also highlights the fact that consent was pretty foreign language in Carmacks. It's not a word that a lot of people use, so consent came up a lot. So the third expectation was the mitigation of resource barriers. And resource barriers have received attention in literature. Lots of people, I'm sure, are thinking, oh, we've heard that before. But it's often about financial barriers and human resource barriers. But what I heard in Carmacks was more about community members' understandings of modern treaties and the associated rights. So this is called educational resource barriers on your handout, but that's pretty limited language, I recognize. So we heard we need chances for LSCFN citizens to learn about our final agreements and the umbrella final agreement and YESAB. It's important that we understand these things and what they mean for our rights and mine development. And to be clear, we're not talking about formal education. We're not talking about people need to go to university, but this is just pointing to sort of a lack of resources, programming and educational resources that have resulted in a limited understanding of modern governance and rights by most citizens. And the concern is, how can you defend your rights if you don't really know what they are? You don't have a good sense of that. So that's a real limitation to effective engagement. So now I'm going to turn it to you and make you work for a few minutes. Then I'll take it back and do some more reflections and leave time for discussion at the end. But I'm going to invite you to consider the 11 expectations that are in front of you. And with your table or the folks around you, ask yourself how and whether they might apply to your own community or the nations that you work for, depending on who you are. So I'll give you a few minutes to reflect. They're up here, might be hard to see at the back. But ask yourself, what resonates here? What would our nation also say? And what feels like it's missing? Because I'm sure we didn't capture everybody's perspectives perfectly in 11 points. So I'll give you a few minutes to discuss that, and then I'll call us back together and maybe a few people can share. So go for it. Okay, so I'll pull us all back together. Does anyone have any sort of key points that they came up with? Anything here that you said, yeah, that we would say that too, that really resonates, or anything where you say, oh, you missed the mark, we would have said something totally different? Oh, sure, yeah. Chris will grab a mic for us. You can stick up your hand while we're waiting for the mic, but anything that sort of stuck out?
Anybody have a question or a concern? If you raise your hand, but not your middle finger, please.
Did we make a perfect framework?
We had a question over here. Oh, here we go. Before I mention our table's comments, or right here. One moment. Ani?
We agree that community engagement is really important, but one of our concerns is how do you get community engagement? For instance, I live on the Six Nations, and we have a population of approximately 12,000 people. Yeah. And it's hard to engage a community of that size. But that's only half of our membership. The other half of the membership doesn't even live on the reserve.
Right.
So it is very difficult to have community engagement when you don't have access to the whole community.
Mm-hmm. I can comment in the context of LSCFN and what their sort of solution was. They're in a similar situation, smaller community, but about half of the citizens live away from Carmacks. And the youth especially were really vocal about this, and they said, we have to send surveys, send phone surveys. Again, this will be different for every community. But what they said is they're still part of our community, and they need to be consulted, especially as youth, I think, for them thinking about moving away, maybe going away to go to school or whatever takes them away from the community, and wanting to stay involved. So for them, it was about surveys were kind of the solution. And making sure that citizens who live away are kept in the loop. But it is complicated. And with a bigger nation, I can see how it's a big undertaking.
Costly?
Costly too, yep.
Then we'd also have to address the issue of education, getting the information to people who are not, say, living on reserve. Mm-hmm. How would we do that?
Yeah, so I think similarly, I think it was Michael maybe said today, from San's experience, having lots of citizens living in Toronto, they did they repeated sessions in big centers where lots of citizens might be living. So that's one option. Again, the kind of mailed surveys, I think there's some stuff that can be done with the internet these days, but you know your nation's best, and these approaches will be different.
I know our community did something like that for engagement in the urban center. It was at the Little NHL, which was interesting, and they got quite a few people for that. But of course, they had to offer lunch, food gathers.
Yeah. I think in the front, maybe if I, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
Vernon, go ahead.
We got,
Hey, Gutch. I guess something kind of triggered my thinking when we used the example of Six Nations, where they have 24,000 people for their total population. What numbers do we look at in terms of percentage of acceptance? Do we look at a 51% according to the government and how they do things? Does majority rule, or does community acceptance, like, and what is community acceptance? What if you have people that are really opposed to something, but yet there are, we'll say, larger number who accept what's going on? So what happens to that minority group? That kind of scenario, what do we do with that?
Sure. And I think that that is kind of captured under this idea of appropriate representation, you know, for community members to be represented. And again, this will be different for LSCFN in their constitution. For referenda, I think it's 74%, 70 or 74% that they need to pass something. Different for all communities. I know some communities have really established practices around consensus and what it looks like building that. So yeah, so appropriate representation, again, what that looks like for your community is going to be different than what it looks like for another community. But we think that that is something important to pay attention to. So yeah.
I'm also concerned about getting community involved, because I know the two communities here had buses to attend this conference, and I think there was only 2 people on each bus. So I know there's a problem there with getting community involved. And I think one reason maybe is they just feel that all of this is just a hopeless situation, that they're going to go ahead and do these things anyway, and what's the use? And they don't realize that power is with the people. So if we can somehow get them to realize that they have the power to do something and to be active, and to, you know, if they know what they can be doing and how important it is, that's the message we have to get across to them, to motivate them to get involved. Because right now they just figure, oh, let council deal with it, you know, and we want them to provide us with all this information, and council can only do so much. Mm-hmm. So they also have to be involved and make them feel that they have all the power. Mm-hmm. Council doesn't have all the power. It comes from the people, from the community. So that's what we have to get across to them.
Yeah, I think you touched on 2 really important points there. One is about resource barriers. People are busy. People have jobs. People have family stresses. It's tough to come out to a meeting at the end of a long day. It's similar issues in Carmacks. And then, yeah, again, it's about representation. How do we have an education about rights? How do we let people know what their rights are, and that there is some hope and power there? Maybe take one more, and then I think I'll pull us back and then leave time for discussion at the end.
Thank you. For about 5 or 6 years, I received mail, I live in Port Elgin, I received mail indicating that there would be no spent fuel in the DGR they were building or advocating for in Kincardine. And then all of a sudden, 5 communities surrounding Kincardine were bidding for the high-level spent fuel DGR, a second DGR, which is in the same community. So, in my view, trust of the proponent is the key, and to be told everything up front. And in my view, we were defrauded that spent fuel was not coming. And then all of a sudden, 5 or 6 years later, it was. I wouldn't trust OPG to mow my lawn now.
Right, and I don't know as much about that situation, but I think you highlight a good point that trust of the proponent is really key. It's often tough to find, and that there are concerns about changes being made down the line. Right, you were told something wouldn't happen. you maybe made an agreement, and then changes have been made without further engagement. So for LSCFN, that was a big concern too around mining, and that was why people enforced over and over again the importance of ongoing engagement and ongoing relationship with the proponent.
One more?
Sure, we'll squeeze one in, one more.
I like it. I have to go one more because it's a young person. I always say, young
Sure.
people, speak up.
She's passing the mic to me.
Oh.
Yes. So I'm speaking from a little bit of another northern context from the Northwest Territories. I work and have worked for several co-management boards where decision-making is co-management, where representation from First Nations are on the decision-making boards. We wanted to highlight a couple of points here. In the Northwest Territories, which is maybe a slightly more mature system than what the YESA process is in the Yukon. But one of the key requirements for any proponent or developer before their applications are even considered complete is that they have to finalize engagement plans, which are life of project plans with each of the directly affected communities. So that's really important just to start the engagement process with a clear agreement on plans to go forward. Again, the regulators and government need to, and developers need to fulfill those, and that's something that's an ongoing concern, but we at least are beginning that path. One of the other things that I heard about was getting community involved. I work now for a board that does environmental assessments. We have responsibilities as the people who are doing these processes to not just consider comments that come in from governance organizations that are at the sort of the top end of the community. We make sure that we go in at every phase of the environmental assessment process into each of the communities. It takes a lot of resources to do, but for true meaningful consideration of community concerns, that has to happen all in a good environmental assessment process. And with that, we've seen where we get comments from communities that may say, we're okay with this project, let's move to the next phase. But then we go into the communities and it's a very different story.
Sure.
And the boards then change how they move forward with their outcomes. So.
Yeah. I'm just going to move us along with a few more comments, if that's okay, Chris, and then we can have time for more discussion at the end, because I think
Absolutely.
there's a lot of good expertise in the room. So what did we learn through this work in Carmacks? So in the Yukon, despite some instances of consent-like rights held by First Nations as a result of modern treaties, in the case of LSCFN, there's not a comprehensive or sort of ratified set of expectations regarding FPIC. There might have been some internal conversations around the Supreme Court case in 2010, but this research represents the first time that LSCFN has really articulated this publicly, these expectations of consent. And this is evidenced by the fact that the Director of Lands tells me that consent is not in my vocabulary. It's not language that he uses. And focus groups switched really quickly from using the term consent to using the language of permission, because consent isn't a word that's used in Carmacks anyway. So a year ago, LSCFN might not have been prepared if a proponent came and said, hey, we want your FPIC. They hadn't had time to sort of formulate that as a community. So we're in a situation where, in some ways, Canada is endeavoring to implement FPIC as part of UNDRIP, but nations like LSCFN haven't articulated what they expect of a meaningful process. All the while, major projects like Casino continue to come down the pipe. I just used Casino as an example because it's close to Carmacks. So this is cause for reflection. So when thinking about how we move forward to implement FPIC then in a meaningful way, there are two approaches for which I would advocate based on the work that I did with LSCFN. The first is a relational approach to FPIC, and this recognizes the creation and maintenance of relationships as really key to realizing FPIC. And the second is a regional approach, whereby FPIC is sort of defined and implemented region by region, rather than as a large scale, rather than making a made-in-Canada approach to FPIC. There's a Carmacks approach to FPIC, there's a Saugeen approach to FPIC. Each community determines this for themselves. And this might look like these sort of regionally or nation-specific approaches nested under some larger understanding. And for those of you who are familiar, that kind of mirrors the format of the Yukon's umbrella final agreement, having this big overarching understanding, and then each nation makes sense of that for themselves within. So I see these approaches to be beneficial in the realization of FPIC because they respond to LSCFN's 11 expectations. So what I did here, this is just sort of a quick exercise, but we grouped the 11 things that LSCFN expects of a meaningful FPIC process under the approach which might be able to respond to them. And I should note that there's overlap here. I just did this quickly to sort of show that, hey, early engagement, that shows relationship. That shows a relationship-centered approach to FPIC. But this is just a preliminary exercise. So what have we contributed here to the bigger conversation about FPIC? How is this of use to you who are outside of the Yukon? Well, one, we've done a really in-depth case study with one First Nation that you can sort of take and apply and see how useful it is and change. We've done a refinement of scholarship, so we added those 3 sort of expectations that academics aren't really talking about, but that LSCFN said, hey, this is important to us. We have now a structure for an assessment of contemporary governance mechanisms, and this is what I tested on IRMA, the certification system. And for LSCFN, importantly, now they have a tool that they can use, this sort of framework, to assess future consultation or consent processes and say, does this line up with how we think things should be done? LSCFN, the government was also provided with a set of data describing the expectations of a lot of their citizens, roughly a third, 30% of the adults. And they can use this data to inform the creation of, say, a consultation guide, a consent guide, proponent engagement, future legislation, and any agreements really about lands and resources. So that's what I was able to give them out of this project. A really important piece of doing research in a good way or decolonizing research is mobilizing knowledge, sharing knowledge in a way that's of use. So LSCFN has a really great book series to tell traditional stories mostly, but increasingly they're using them to tell governance stories. And they're plain language, illustrated books that incorporate the Northern Tutchone language. So there's one that they created a few years ago called How We Got Self-Government. This is for community members to familiarize themselves with that process and know that story. But early in my work with LSCFN, it became really clear that many citizens don't have a good understanding of YESAB, which is the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board. And there's an act that goes with it too. So lots of citizens have lots of concerns, but they don't know what YESAB is, that it exists, that it came from their land claim, importantly. So we created an illustrated book to tell that story, this sort of origin story and a bit of the function. So this is translation of technical information into a format that's accessible for citizens. And this format will be different for different communities. I know some communities have really well-established video sort of series. Some nations are using a lot of web-based apps, but for Carmacks, they've got a really good series of illustrated books, so we built on that. And we're hoping that this will be incorporated in the elementary school system and high school in the coming years, so that there's a new generation coming up who knows these processes and knows how to use them. And this is an effort to respond to what we talked about, how many citizens feel ill-informed. So just in closing, there's a lot of work to be done left about FPIC. It would be really fascinating to look at FPIC in other regions with modern land claims and self-government agreements and see how they're addressing it or adopting it or not. Looking at those relational and regional approaches that I talked about, I think we still have a lot of work to do to understand what those might mean in practice. There's a need to explore the role of circular and linear processes in an FPIC negotiation and deliberation and how they might be used together. So that's a bit of bringing together the different worldviews like we've spoken about a bit this week. And finally, this call for a regionally specific approach to FPIC, so nation by nation knowing what FPIC means to them, might call for repeating this type of exercise with other nations, asking, what does meaningful FPIC look like to us? And can we record that in some ways? Because expectations will differ. And if you have keen master students or PhD students knocking at your door, this could be a good exercise to put them to work on. There can be beneficial partnerships in that way. I won't promote it too much, but it's an idea. So Missasaugas and Miigwech, so much for your time today. Missasaugas is Northern Tutchone, for those who aren't familiar. I really appreciate your time and attention and participation in that exercise. But I've left a little bit of time now for us to discuss more, because I think there's a lot of expertise in the room. I'll put my contact information here if anyone is interested in being in touch. So I'd invite further discussion, and I'd also invite those in the room who have specific expertise more than I do to respond to questions as well. Chime in when you feel like you might have something to say.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's have a discussion. I was looking at
Chris
the
is
framework.
ready.
Hey?
You're ready for a discussion.
I'm all ready for a discussion. We were actually talking about number 6 there on enforceability.
Mm-hmm.
I think we run into that a lot in our communities, especially with, you know, how we're handcuffed through the Indian Act and so forth when we deliver things. Who's going to enforce it? Because if you do have a justice system in your community, like in Carmacks we do, they still, like our tribal police, they still feel like they follow the Ontario provincial police system. They forget that they're answerable to the chief and council because the chief and council speaks for the people on their behalf, you know. But the enforceability is something of, you know, how would that be done? When we were describing that earlier, so.
Yeah, I can say again what I talked
Yeah.
about. So enforceability of whom, by whom, to whom. So I think there's two pieces there. One is the short-term sort of enforceability of the right to give FPIC. So, you know, for the nation to be able to enforce their right and for the proponent to adhere to that. But then also, Michael said this morning, you know, consent is yes, but, no, but. And that but is the conditions on which that consent is maybe provided. So that's looking at the long term and, you know, enforcing that the proponent or the company is following those promises made, that there's some enforcement there around holding their feet to the fire, and that they're adhering to the promises they made when consent was issued. So there's kind of two sides there, short term and long term.
You know, quite a few years ago, we had something similar in our community for dolomite. And the traditional people spoke about that, and they weren't too sure, but they waved a carrot in front of the people about employment, jobs. But when we looked at it, it was mainly just manual labor, building the road type of thing. There wasn't anything more higher. So, which led to a lot of our young people, you know, getting into heavy equipment operations, stuff like that, and environmental assessments and so forth to address that. So if it ever comes up again, that we can actually co-manage, you know, things like that. There, we got another one. All righty.
Good fishing. My question is more or less to the dynamics of the Yukon as to you mentioned the land claim settlement. What year was that?
So in 1993, the Umbrella Final Agreement was signed, which was sort of this general framework. And then within that, First Nations negotiated their own land claims. So each nation signed at a different year. LSCFN, I think, was 1997, and some haven't signed. So the years sort of vary.
So part of the framework in doing business in the territory then, talking about Labrador, is early engagement. But how many of these existing mines are new? How many are just getting established, and how many are already existing? Like, how hard is it to push back on the old school, the old way of doing business? Because you have an opportunity with the casino mine to get them into a process. Mm-hmm. Some of the existing mines, those CEOs and those boards might be saying we're not going to enter into an agreement.
Sure.
So that's my confusion, I guess.
Yeah. So how does the timing of the land claims match up with some of the older mines? So one interesting example there. So the settlement lands that we looked at, the purple patches and the orange patches, if you remember, were the mines. So Minto Mine is an interesting example. It's a mine on Natchonayaktan traditional territory, or settlement lands, on their settlement lands. And the mine was there before they signed their final agreement. So that's been a situation where sort of retroactively they've made some agreements with Natchonayaktan and the Minto Mine. I don't know that much about it. Maybe there are others in the room who know more. But that's sort of one of interesting timing, where they've had to say, okay, moving forward, what do we expect of this mine that's already here and already on land that's important to us?
Okay.
You can ask each other questions too. I can just be here to facilitate.
Any other questions? April? Okay. All right. Well, Emily, that was awesome.